ghoulies and ghosties.
From ghoulies and ghosties.
And long-leggedy beasties.
And long-legged beasties.
And things that go bump in the night. Good Lord! Deliver us.
Deliver us.
Hey there, spooks and spookettes, Count Drahoon here, and this evening on Count Drahoon Presents, I give you a little retrospect of folk horror. What is folk horror? Well, I'll explain in just a moment. But before I do, be sure to like this video and subscribe to Count Drahoon Presents so that you can get notifications for more videos like this. Of course, if you already have, thank you so much for your support. And might I invite you to take your support just a step further if you are so led, to become a patron through my Patreon page. For $1 a month, you get an exclusive video on the Patreon page that are made from topics that are suggested by viewers like you. For instance, if you wanted me to make a video on what it would be like if the Harlem Globetrotters were made of a bunch of ghosts, I'd make a video about it. I don't know why you'd want to know that, but if you really desperately need to know, I will do my best. Now for $5 a month, you get that, plus exclusive access to our private Discord channel, and your name will appear at the credits at the end of every episode. And now that that's out of the way, let's get into the heart of the matter, and hopefully you won't feel the need to drive a stake through it. So, folk horror, it's one of those things where it's hard to explain, but once you see it, you know that's what it is. That's a lie. There's actually a really good definition of what folk horror is, and I'll read it here in just a second. So folk horror, according to the ever-so-reliable Wikipedia, is a subgenre of horror film and horror fiction that uses elements of folklore to invoke fear and foreboding. That's the basic gist. What I'll add to that is that a lot of times in folk horror movies you see a sort of duality. Modern times versus the olden days. Christianity versus paganism. The natural primeval world versus our modern materialistic world, and how these two things sort of clash. Sometimes these things are interchangeable, sometimes these things are mixed together. All in all, it makes for a very interesting and oftentimes very brutal concept for a horror movie. So what I'll do for the remainder of this video is take you through 3 of my favorite folk horror films to give you sort of a primer as you dive into this great subgenre. So the first movie that I want to talk about, Blood on Satan's Claw, from 1971 from Tigran Production. Tigran is a little bit of a lesser known of the British horror production studios during this time. Of course, Hammer was the big one. Another one, of course, is Amicus. They were really famous for making the anthology horror films. That was a good lane, a good niche for them to fall into. Tigran made, I guess in some respects, even lower budget horror films than these other 2 studios. However, they were known to produce some pretty good ones, and Blood on Satan's Claw is probably one of their most prominent feature films. Now, this film essentially follows the youth of a village in 1600s England in the countryside. They are slowly but surely falling under the influence of Satan. Of course, the more they fall under Satan's control, the more violent they become, basically throwing this little country village that's very quiet into a lot of chaotic upheaval. And it's interesting because these kids are each marked by Satan in different ways. It's a sort of patch of hair that starts to grow in different parts of their bodies. And what they do is they sort of convene in the forest, and through ritualistic sacrifice, they sort of either cut off these portions of the skin willingly so that Satan can essentially materialize himself into the world, or in some cases they just sacrifice the victim so that they can then take the skin and build upon Satan from there. What's interesting to me about this movie, for one thing, for a low-budget film to have this kind of production value is fascinating to me. I often wonder if Robert Eggers watched this movie when he was developing the concept for The Witch. It's a very similar setting. Of course, The Witch is set in colonial America, whereas this is set in the countryside in England. But it has a very similar aesthetic. This particular movie seems to rely a lot on natural lighting, which in some cases you see in the movie that there's a lot of overcast, which brings a very interesting aesthetic to the movie. In some ways, it kind of, well, it overcasts the tone of the movie in some ways. You do get this foreboding sense of doom and dread that I don't think you would have gotten from a film of this era, really in a bigger budget setting, which they would have used studio lighting. I mean, it's really fascinating how they were able to get this movie done in that way. And of course, what's disturbing about this movie is that, of course, you know, eventually the youth that, you know, devolves into this satanic cult, they are up against the judge of the village, who he goes away to London for a time and then comes back towards the end of the movie, basically to, you know, put an end to all this chaos and madness. And it's interesting to me because, spoiler alert, they do defeat Satan at the end of the movie. But another disturbing aspect is just really disturbing how slowly but surely the youth becomes corrupted, and just the weird turn that they take doing some of the evil things that end up happening in this movie. From murder, ritualistic sacrifice, ritualistic assault. It's, you know, some may say that it can be a bit gratuitous. Maybe there's a valid point to that, but I think it's played well. It didn't strike me as gratuitous at all. It was used effectively as a tool to disturb and to unsettle. And the filmmaker shot all of that very well. I will say that the happy ending is definitely not happy for a few reasons. The big thing is that, you know, at the end of the movie, Satan is defeated. But it seems to me that the youth are so far gone into their possession, it's almost as if they've become one with Satan, and they're not particularly happy with the fact that they've been liberated from the forces of evil. It's like they seem to like being bad and like doing horrible things, and they're a bit disappointed that now they don't have an excuse to continue their reign of terror. That's one way of looking at it, but in another light, it's like, even if they do recover later on down the road, it's like, what do you do with this? You know, you get older, and maybe the spell falls away, the scales come off of your eyes, but then you realize that you were involved with some pretty horrible things. And it's like, how do you live with yourself? Because everybody, more or less, in this village, except for a couple of exceptions, are complicit in all of this. And it's an interesting question. Like, how do you move forward from this? Yeah, but going back to the production value, I mean, just everything is super authentic. Everything from the costuming to the sets, and just the look of it, too. It's very dirty, which you don't really see in a lot of period pieces made at this time. You know, they all sort of had this sleek aesthetic, and you can really tell that the filmmakers were striving to make this as period authentic as they possibly could. Because this is, I mean, take it from me, I lived through the 1600s. This is pretty accurate to how rural life in England in the 1600s was. It was dirty. Even the, I don't know if you could call the judge an aristocrat, but, you know, he was a little bit of a higher status than the rest of the peasants in this movie. But even then, it's like, it's not a lavish lifestyle that he's living. I mean, he's living in a sort of a quaint, comfortable country life, and it's really played very well. You don't really see any extravagance until you get to the London scenes, which are very brief and far between for the rest of the movie. Moving on to the next movie, and my little primer, is the original Wicker Man from 1973, not the one with Nicolas Cage. Yes, avoid the bees, because they are bad. No, this is the original one. It's a much more sophisticated movie, and of course, co-stars Christopher Lee. In my opinion, one of his best roles. Of course, we're accustomed to seeing Sir Christopher Lee in different villain roles throughout the decades, particularly as Count Dracula, Count Dooku, Saruman, even Scaramanga in The Man with the Golden Gun, in the James Bond franchise. But this is a villain that's quite different. But it's just his demeanor throughout the whole movie. It's like a cross between just super happy-go-lucky and psychopathy. They sort of blend together in a particularly creepy way. And I think it's a performance that I won't go so far as to say that it's underrated, but I do still think that it could be talked about a little bit more. So I really enjoyed his portrayal of Lord Summer Isle. But going back to some of the themes that I talked about at the top of the video, you know, this is definitely more about a clash between Christianity and paganism. Of course, Summer Isle, which is where the film takes place, it's the home of a predominantly pagan population. We learned through Lord Summer Isle that his father was actually the one that sort of made the village revert back to paganism so that they could make sacrifices so that the crops would be plentiful and that their standard of living would essentially go back up. It's interesting because the detective comes to Summer Isle because he receives a mysterious letter that a particular young girl who is native to the island has gone missing. So he gets there, and again, it's a very off-putting place because everything is so bright and colorful, and all the folks seem to be very, very friendly, but him being sort of a standard older English gentleman brought up in the Anglican Church, seemingly having a very traditional outlook about the world, coming to this place where in some ways it's still modern, but in others it's like going back to, before St. Patrick came to, the British Isles and, into Ireland. It's a very unusual place for him. The folks are very open about, talking about procreation and just, encouraging non-traditional, non-Christian lifestyles. And in some ways it's interesting because he is put off by all this, but at the same time there is sort of a slight temptation, especially with the innkeeper's daughter, who seems to fancy him a little bit. And he can't get a straight answer from anybody on the island, which is also very strange because it seems that everyone's sort of playing games with him. And with all this going on, the pleasantness of the people that live on the island, also the soundtrack, which is very folksy but very up-tempo, it kind of gets under your skin. It makes things very uncomfortable as the movie progresses and you realize that basically everybody is in on it. So we find out at the end of the movie that, yes, everybody was in on it, but not for the reasons that we thought. It turns out that the young girl who went missing, she was in on it too. They did all of this as a trick to get the detective to come to the island, because the detective is going to be the sacrifice, because he is a virgin. He's betrothed to a woman back in England, but they have not consummated yet because he's waiting to consummate their actual marriage. So he's basically, in some ways, a perfect sacrifice for their fertility ritual. And that's what happens. That's why the movie is called The Wicker Man. He's offered up into this giant wicker man, kind of like Burning Man in a way, and he's set ablaze. And it's a weird juxtaposition because, in a cruel, strange way, both parties get what they want in this ritual. The detective, offered as this perfect sacrifice, becomes a martyr. In some ways, he sort of reflects the sacrificial nature of Christ and, some of the early apostles in the book of Acts. But then also, the pagans get what they want because they have this unblemished sacrifice that they've made, and their crops continue to grow, and they continue to live this peppy, happy life in Summer Isle. So it's a fascinating blend how these two things come together. And again, this movie sort of reflects the chaotic nature of England in the early 1970s. This fear that the modern world is sort of collapsing on itself, and that all the advances of Western civilization are actually not making things better for everyday people. So there's sort of this primal instinct to revert back to the pre-Christian era. There's maybe praying to the old gods will bring about prosperity. And, and of course, these particular pagan gods are, intertwined in nature, which most pagan pantheons are. These are gods of sun, gods of fertility, and things like that. So there's sort of this urge to return back to that, to revert back to that that pre-natural state in order to to combat the disorder and chaos of the modern world that they live in, that they thought was going to be safe, because a lot of the advances in medicine and technology, in a lot of ways, were actually facilitated by the early church. So it's an interesting dynamic that they have going on there. So there's a lot there, a lot said, in very subtle ways. So again, that's why I love this movie so much. Why The Wicker Man is, it is regarded as perhaps the best folk horror film of all time. And this was also during a time in England where, you had a lot of economic upheaval, but essentially the empire was done. It had been in steady decline since the end of World War II. It was officially wrapped by the early 60s. And, England was the most powerful, the biggest empire in the world up to that point. And I'm sure that the collapse of the empire was an apocalyptic moment for a lot of the older generations. I guess in some ways, this new order that they found that's supposed to bring peace of mind, well, it does for some, but in some ways it does still retain a lot of violence and chaos from the previous order that they have deemed has collapsed. So it's an interesting thought exercise, I think. So if you haven't already, go see the original Wicker Man. Our third film, unlike the other two films that were British productions, this one is from Russia. Specifically, it is the first horror movie ever made under the Soviet Union. From 1967, it is V, based off of the novella by Nikolai Gogol. It's fascinating to me because what you have with a lot of these filmmakers from Russia, from Eastern Europe during this time. Particularly those that sort of dabbled in horror films or horror-adjacent movies. It's the same parallel that you see with a lot of Western filmmakers that are doing movies in the same genre. Those movies in the West were seen as very counterculture, and it was more or less viewed the same way in Russia and in Eastern Europe. But the interesting twist here is that in the West, you see a lot of these movies where, you know, like The Wicker Man, you see sort of a theme of a return to a pre-Christian state, where you have the folks of Summer Isle that are willing to become pagans, to pray to the old gods, and to sort of revert back to a state of nature. In Russia, you have something a little different. Instead, you have a sort of a nostalgia, a longing to return to a pre-Soviet Russia, to their Orthodox Christian roots, because there is a mystical component to the Orthodox Christian faith, in that by going back to this faith, you can make sense of the darkness of the world, and perhaps find a way to combat it through, more spiritual conventions. You see this a lot in the films of Andrei Tarkovsky, and you can definitely see that a little bit in this particular movie. Now, of course, this source material comes from, before the fall of the Tsarist Russia. V was written in the 1860s by Gogol. Of course, Gogol was a practicing Orthodox Christian. And basically the plot, the film is pretty close to the novella. It's about a seminary student who stays the night in a rural farmhouse, and he basically kills a witch. Now, after he returns to seminary, he gets a strange call to return back to the village that he just came out of, to preach a funeral, but then also to keep vigil at the night of this young woman who has died for 3 nights. The young woman in question happens to look like the witch he presumably killed. This old woman who is the witch takes on the form of a younger woman, and he sees the image of the younger woman in this young woman who has requested his services to preach her funeral. And of course, each night he prays the vigil, and he is haunted and attacked by demonic forces that are stemming from the power of this witch. And it's up to him to basically put a cap on all of this madness. This is a beautifully shot movie. It's very dark, gothic in nature. It has some really fascinating creature effects. Just as comparable to a lot of the special effects that you see in Western movies. In some cases, they actually might be a little bit more advanced. There's great use of makeup special effects, but then also sort of, it looks like animatronics, but it's really more of like the Godzilla soup monster kind of thing. Beautiful tableaus. And like I said, this is a pretty good adaptation of Gogol's short story. There's not a whole lot of difference between the two. As a matter of fact, the similarities are so stark that I basically kind of forgot what they left out or added into the movie. So those are my 3 favorite folk horror movies, but I'd love to hear from you. What are your favorites? Comment below and let me know if you've seen any of these movies, or if you have any recommendations that maybe I missed over the course of my very long life through the centuries. But anyway, thanks for watching, and be sure to like this video and subscribe to Count Drahoon Presents if you haven't already, so you can get notifications for my next video. Until then, as far as things go, when things go bump in the night, there are such things.
From ghoulies and ghosties.
From ghoulies and ghosties.
And long-leggedy beasties.
And long-legged beasties.
And things that go bump in the night. Good Lord! Deliver us.